Thank you so much. Okay, hi guys, my name is Emma Bobby and I'm a senior studying biomedical sciences and psychology. I will be graduating this December with my bachelor's in science. And yeah.
Hi, I am the other person working on the thesis. My name is Emily Nguyen. I'm also a senior. I'm graduating May 2026 and I major in biological sciences. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and then we could go ahead and start presenting.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emma Bobby, and this is my research partner, Emily Nguyen. And today we're excited to present our undergraduate honors thesis titled The Role of Emotion Understanding and Language Comprehension in the Development of Theory of Mind. This project was completed under the mentorship of Dr. Alma Arce, along with the guidance with all of our committee members here today. So we're going to walk through why we studied this topic, how we conducted our research, what we found, and what these findings mean for early childhood development.
Right, and so for context, we want to highlight why the ages of 3 to 5 are such a critical developmental window. And so previous literature, such as Bailey 2002, describes that this period is a sensitive period where a lot of the timing of these experiences have powerful and long-lasting effects on both cognitive, emotional, and social growth. But recent literature has been saying that sensitive period isn't really the correct terminology, but rather the exposure to experiences instead of simply just based on age alone, a rigid window. And so a theoretical review that was talking about experience and brain development in 1987 by Greeno, Black, and Wallace was discussing a mechanism for this sensitive period known as brain plasticity. And so they distinguish it between two types of processes, the experience expectant processes as well as experience dependent processes. So with expectant processes, brain systems are prepared to receive input such as just language exposure, versus dependent processes is where development is shaped by a child's unique environment and exposure to experiences. And so between the ages of 3 to 5, both of these processes operate very intensely and at both of them. And so it's an ideal age to examine how these three constructs of language, emotion, understanding, and social cognitive abilities, such as theory of mind, begin to bridge and connect. And these abilities don't develop all at the same pace, and we're going to discuss that more later. Some children tend to show advanced language skills but have weaker emotional inference skills or emotional understanding, while others could excel socially before even having a strong grip on language comprehension. And this variability is very normal. To understand which skills support each other versus which ones develop more independently. And so our study is focusing on three of these constructs: language, theory of mind, and emotional understanding. Starting with language, it's more than just vocab. It's a tool that children use to interpret their social situations, express themselves, as well as just understanding others in general. And so Zimmerman in 2009 found that rich back and forth conversations, whether it be with their peers or adults, is a strong predictor of language development. And so when it comes to talking with adults, there's this thing called zone of proximal development, where adults should be speaking to their children in a sophisticated manner that isn't too sophisticated, where they get confused, but it prompts that development, but not too baby-like, where it's too simple and they don't really have room to grow. And so in having better language skills, they could better communicate, as well as have better peer interaction. Defined it as the ability to understand one's own as well as others' mental states. And so studies like Ullman in 2010 show that Tom, the theory of mind, develops in predictable stages in a very trajectory-like manner, where eventually children understand false beliefs, emotions, and this ties into our assessment that we'll later discuss with pre-preliminary tests and to belief-based tasks. For emotion understanding, EU, it includes identifying emotions, labeling them, and recognizing those types of cues, whether it be through situations or on the other person's face. And so Denham in 1996 demonstrated that young children reliably understood four basic emotions: happy, sad, mad, and scared. And that's because these four emotions, they tend to emerge very early and are recognized universally, having very clear situational cues that even preschoolers can understand.
So what's interesting is that many of the researchers that we talked about and we will discuss more argue that these constructs have some mutual support for each other. So we will talk about Herbert Myers in 2006. He had linked early language skills to later social competence, which was seen in children. Also, there's Egham in 2011. He conducted a study that connected emotion understanding to pro-social behavior in children. And also Lane in 2010, which we will talk about much more in the rest in the study, found that theory of mind and emotion understanding both predict moral development. So some of these theories suggest that these three constructs go hand in hand, and that's kind of where the basis of our thesis and our hypothesis was formed.
Yeah, and to touch on more prior research, across multiple studies, we see that there's a consistent relationship between these three constructs. For example, for Zimmerman and Wellman, they found that there was a consistent relationship with language and Tom, and they found that children with stronger language skills tended to perform better on Tom tasks. And the reason behind that is because language provides that vocabulary and grammar needed to get that Tom passing. And so that really comes down to like complement clause syntax, which is basically just them being able to represent and express that others have their own beliefs, such as quote unquote like she thinks that or he believes that. And this is also shown in Devilliers in 2014, where they did examine that mastery of complement. The mastery of complement clause syntax eventually led to Tom's success. For Egham and Grazani, they saw that there was a strong tie between emotional understanding and Tom. For Egham, they found that children who were able to label and understand emotions tended to be better at perspective taking and therefore like having a theory of mind. Versus Grazani said that they have had findings that showed emotional understanding and theory of mind are related partly because they both rely on children's ability to express internal states, whether it be their own or others. And for Denham and Herbert Myers, they saw that emotional understanding and language led to better social development and better peer interactions because understanding others' emotions as well as communicating effectively through good language skills lead to better emotions development.
And also with these researchers, we also saw that there were some researchers that found variation with age for these constructs. So we will talk about Sarmento Henrique in 2019. He had found a strong link between emotion understanding and language at age 3, but noticed that this had significantly declined by the age of 5. And similarly with Lane, which I had spoken about earlier, in 2010, he found major variations within this age range, suggesting that these abilities can be misaligned early in childhood development. So these mixed results are partly why replication and our use of the Denham method was used in our study.
Yeah, so to go back to Sarmento and Henrique, that is actually the study we're doing a systematic replication on. And so they studied a Spanish-speaking preschooler sample where they used a test of emotional comprehension, TEC, task from Pond, a past literature. And so with that task, as well as a language-based task and a Tom task, or assessments, they found strong relations between those three: language, emotion comprehension, and Tom, but mainly for younger preschoolers, so closer to 3 than 5. But their study also had several constraints. So with the TEC, they only used 4 out of the 9 subscales, and they only picked those simply because it was solvable by around 55% of the 5-year-olds in the original literature. And a lot of those TEC items rely on static cartoon images rather than something interactive and dynamic like Denham, which we will discuss a little bit later. And it also had like those cultural and language constructs because it was very Spanish-based and it was expressed Spanish. There was no English translation available. And so to address these issues, we used Denham's dynamic puppet assessment from her study in 1996 instead, which is more engaging and more developmentally appropriate because it is so engaging. And it better mirrors real life emotional understanding because through it, the scenes were acted out through puppets and the examiner who was running the assessments actually showed their emotions on their face as well as their tonality. This difference is very important because young children are more responsive to these play-based interactive tasks rather than something that's static and not as playful. By shifting this, we aim to increase validity and just better capture emotional understanding for this age range. Overall, our study explores how these 3 constructs relate to one another during a period that is filled with just rapid development, although it may be uneven, which we will discuss later on through Lane. But we weren't just testing whether they correlate, we wanted to see how they are interconnected or how they just depend. they develop. And our hypothesis, based on the literature, we hypothesized that having a high PBT standard score, or that's high language skills, and having high EU score, so high scoring in the Puppet Show, increases the probability of passing prom. And in doing so, we also predicted that we would see direct positive correlations among these three domains, where having a high PBT score increases the likelihood of passing prom, and the same thing we said with having a high
So with these predictions in mind, I'll now walk through how we designed our study and how we operationalized each of our concepts. So to start, for our participants, we had recruited 47 children aged 3 to 5 from both the ASU Child Study Lab run by Dr. Cuthbert and the Child Development Lab. And after attrition was included, we had 39 children ran for the PPBT assessment, 42 children for the TOM assessment, and 43 children for the puppet assessment. So that's a limitation we will talk about later. And for the gender distribution, we had it roughly around 47% were female and 53% were male. So we were trying to get an equal amount of both demographics. So this study was a within subject design, which is basically where each participant is required to tested on all the assessments, the variables that are being tested. And in Lane's study in 2010, he had mentioned that between participant variability. So this is something we were trying to control by doing the within subject design. So all assessments were conducted during recess or quiet playtime so that the instructional time of the children were not disrupted. We also standardized protocol to minimize any confounding variables such as mood, fatigue, or test anxiety, which is very likely in such a young demographic. So some of the things we did was testing rooms, standardized testing rooms. So all children in the CSL would be tested in CSL rooms. All children in the Child Development Lab would be tested in Child Development, like their facility. Everyone had scripted instructions. So all examiners, including the 5 additional examiners that we had trained, all used the same script. They were required to read the same instructions to each of the children. They followed the same protocol for each assessment for each child. And then additionally, another important thing we had to do was, since we were working with children, we had to gain verbal assent from each child. So tests were not run until we were given that cue from the children that we were allowed to test them. And then additionally, because we are working with younger children, we gave small toy incentives so that we could maintain motivation so that they were engaged during the assessments. So now to talk about each of the assessments we did. The first one was P-Body Picture Vocabulary Test. This one can run from around 25 minutes to 30 at max, depending on the participant. So this is an established measure of receptive vocabulary. Children are shown a 4-picture grid like you see in the middle and are asked to point to one of them representing the spoken word by the examiner. So the key features of this test are that there are up to 19 sets. Each of the set has 12 questions, and the task continues until the child misses at least 8 questions in a set. Then we use the standard score from this assessment for correlational analysis.
And PPBT in particular is a strong tool because it does minimize those expressive language demands. Because in this test, children don't have to produce the word, they just have to recognize the word and be able to point it out. And so it helps isolate comprehension rather than expressive skills, which could have introduced more variability.
So then our next test was the theory of mind test. This one was part of the incorporated into the CSL curriculum that we use. So basically, there are 4 prerequisite tasks that a child develops in this order: self-perception, other perception, self-knowledge, and other knowledge. And just to give a little rundown of how these tests work for everyone here, self-perception is basically we're seeing if the child can first talk about their own perspective, vocalize their own perspective. So, for example, we would have a figure like an animal, like a monkey and a dog on the table. Then we would use a board to cover the monkey so that the child couldn't see the monkey. Then we would ask the child, "Can you see the monkey?" And they would pass if they could say no because the board is covering it. This way, they're vocalizing their own perspective, and so we know that they can take. They can say their own perspective. Then the part that we were testing more is the other perception. So we would have the same thing. We would have a monkey and a dog, and then we would bring out a figurine of a little boy. We named him Jack, and we put him in front of the child. Then we would put the board to cover the monkey so that Jack couldn't see the monkey, but the child could still see the monkey. Then we would ask the child, "Can Jack see the monkey?" Here we're testing to see if the child can separate his own perspective from Jack. So we're seeing So he would pass if the child was able to say, no, Jack cannot see the monkey because it's being covered by the board, even though the child can see the monkey. And then the next two prerequisite tasks were self-knowledge and other knowledge. Similar to the first two, we're testing their mental perspective, and then we're seeing if they can reason, if they can separate their own perspective from another's. So we would have a blue and green box, and for example, we would put a crab into the blue box, and the child would see that. Then we would ask the child what is in each of them. If the child says that I know what's in the blue box because I saw it, I don't know what's in the green box because I didn't see it, that's a pass. They know how to, that's how we know that they can take perspective taking. Then for other knowledge, we would have, in our study, we had a red and white box, and we would bring out a figurine, Jack would come back, Jack would see inside one of the boxes, so the child sees Jack looking into the box, then we would ask the child, but the child doesn't look into the box, so then we would ask the child, does Jack know what's inside each of the boxes? So if the child would pass if the child is able to say, yes, Jack knows what's in this box because he looked into it, Jack doesn't know what's in this box because he didn't look into it. So this way we're seeing that even though the child didn't look into the box, he knows that another person looked into it and they have a different perspective from the child. So this is how we were testing that. And for our study, we did not use these tasks. This was just like a prerequisite that we used for the two following tasks, which are the belief-based tasks, which is what we used for our correlational analysis. So for false belief is the first task we had, and it's what we did was we had a Play-Doh box, and the child would see that there was a toy car inside the Play-Doh box, and then we would tell the child to put the car back inside the Play-Doh box. Then we would bring out a figurine, Sally for example, and we would ask the child, does Sally know what's inside the box? And if the child says, Sally thinks it's Play-Doh because it's a Play-Doh box, they would pass. Even though the child knows it's a car. So the false belief is the child knows that Sally is wrong, but if they can vocalize that Sally thinks it's a Play-Doh box, that's a pass. Then for true belief, similarly, in our study, we had a Lego box and we had a lion inside. The child took the lion out and put Legos inside. Then we brought Sally back and we'd ask, does Sally know what's inside the box? And if the child says Sally thinks it's Legos because it's a Lego box, it's a pass. But if the child were to say Sally thinks it's Legos because I put Legos into it, we know that's a fail because Sally wasn't there when the child put the Legos inside the box. So this is showing that if the child is able to say Sally knows it's Legos because it's a Lego box, she's able to distinguish his own perspective from Sally's, who's another person in the situation. So those were the two tests that we used for our analysis. And then the last of the three tests is the Denim Puppet Show, which is the new one that we adapted from Denim Affect Knowledge test that we had used. It has three assessments: the expressive emotion understanding, which labels emotions; the receptive emotion understanding, which identifies emotions that were named by the examiner; and then the situational emotion understanding, which is where the child infers an emotion for a character based on a story.
And so the strength of this measure is that it reflects real-life social interactions rather than the static images used in some mental thinking. And so because of it, children are able to respond more naturally to storytelling and visual cues and keeps them engaged. And so it also helps capture those subtle aspects of emotion understanding given that the examiner is expressing it through their face as well as their voice.
So to prevent fatigue in our procedures, we made sure to use these task orders, these randomized task orders, where we would have the puppet and Tom test done on the same day while PPBT was on a separate day, only because PPBT, as I mentioned before, could last up to 25-30 minutes. And since we are working with such young children, they have the tendency to get distracted, get tired, so we wanted to keep them on separate days. And then testing would occur, we would try to keep most of them between 10 and 3 p.m. to avoid testing them after their lunchtime, or in CDL they had nap time, so we didn't want those to confer cause any distractions to their performance during the assessments. And like I said, we were working with young kids. It's really important to work on their level. We wanted to make sure they were comfortable, and preschoolers are extremely sensitive to unfamiliar adults. So we made sure that all examiners spent at least 2 days becoming familiar with the participants before having testing done, so in order to minimize test anxiety. And additionally, attention level spans in children are much lower, so we wanted to make sure that we standardize time and structure for each of these assessments, so in order to minimize any effects on their performance during the test. So now for the analysis, we used SPSS software, where we conducted tests on descriptive statistics, including Pearson correlation, significant two-step testing, and we also check Cronbach alpha for emotion understanding to see internal consistency between the three subtests. So this allows us to test both our hypothesis and internal coherence between the emotion measures. So the first graph we have here is the mean scores of all the tasks. For legibility and reading purposes, we provided a table as well, which might be more easier to understand. So for example, the PPBT scores are a standardized metric. So the sample ranged from 85 to 155 with a mean of 116 and a large standard deviation of 14. So for example, this difference between this test and the other test, it's a function of the scoring system. It's not an indication that the child performed better on PPBT or not, obviously not as much on TOM. It's more just to show how different that the scale of the scorings were for the different tests. And then for theory of mind, for the tasks that we used, we did use only use the belief-based tasks. So there was we used dichotomous scoring where pass was considered 1 and fail was considered a 0, and because of the scoring we used, we did end up with a mean of 19. But this is also very this is reflective of previous literature, which shows that children do not, in this age range, do not often pass belief-based tasks. So it was kind of in correlation with what we ended up seeing in our findings. And then emotion understanding tasks were clearly scored on a much lower score, where expressive and receptive only went up to 12 points and situational went up to 8 points. So the key point in showing this was not to indicate that there's any, it was just to show that there was no meaningful difference in cognitive abilities. It was more to show that the raw numbers are different because they're on different scoring structures. It's just a table that serves as a descriptive overview of each of the measure scoring structures, so that it gives us some context for later correlations, which we will discuss now. So this is where we actually talked about our hypothesis, and after running correlations on all 5 of the tests, PPBT, TOM, and the 3 subtests of Puppet, we noticed that there was no significant correlation for any of the 5. As you can see, for TOM and PPBT, we only got a 0.23, and then for TOM, with all the puppets, they were all in the negatives with no significant results. And this actually diverges from the studies that we had, from the studies we introduced at the beginning of our study, like Zimmerman and Wellman, who stated that there are clear, strong relations between language, emotion understanding, and TOM. However, this does somewhat align with Lane in 2010. He reported, it was called asynchronous development, which is where children can show strong skills in one domain, but not in others. And this means that a correlation may not appear now and may appear in older preschoolers. And then this was the one significant finding we did find, although it wasn't in our predicted relations. We found a significant relationship between the Puppet expressive and Puppet situational tasks, with a R value of 0.421 and a P value which was pretty significant at 0.005. So this means children who accurately labeled emotions, which was the expressive, were also better at inferring emotions during complex situations, which is the situational aspect. So this finding aligns strongly with the Denham and Grisani studies that we talked about, which argue that expressive and inferential emotional skills share a commonality. And these results suggest that emotion understanding may have an internal coherence, even though it is not strongly connected to language or TOM. So in order to look at this coherence, we decided to do a Cronbach alpha coefficient specifically just on the Puppet test. Basically, for anyone that doesn't know, Cronbach alpha coefficient basically it's just a test to see how well do a set of items reliably measure the same underlying construct. So we want to talk about constructs that have some similarity between. We can't be putting PPBT and TOM into it. We would just be looking at emotional understanding. So with this, we did end up getting a low score of 0.424. And this is below the standard reliability threshold of 0.70, meaning that all 3 of the emotion understanding tests did not operate under a unified scale, even though we did see some correlation just between the 2. So, yeah.
And so like this helps explain that absence of those correlations between PPBT and emotional understanding, as well as like emotional understanding and TOM. And as we said before, this was seen in Lane's study with asynchronous development. And so as Lane suggests, if emotional understanding is still fragmenting into components in this age range of 3 to 5, then internal coherence may not stabilize until later.
All right, and then overall, our results suggest that language, emotional understanding, and theory of mind may be developing independently or at a later age range, as our hypothesis was not supported. This interpretation aligns with Sarmento Henrique's 2019 study, who found diminishing relationships between emotional understanding and language by age 5. So by, like we had said before, from 3 to 5, it had significantly decreased. And also with Lane's study where he reported broad within group variations. It also suggests that previous findings of strong correlations may apply more to older preschoolers, as we said, or different assessment tools that we did not do in the present study. So some of the major limitations with the study included small sample size, as we had brought up. There were some students that said no to being run. There were some students that were unable to be run because of time constraints. And there was even a student who we got and then they were too young to be run. So our sample size did dwindle down a little bit depending on the assessment after we had recruited 47 students. Additionally, potential insensitivity during TOM measuring, we chose to use the 2 belief-based tasks, which did force us to do a 0-1 scoring, but if we had looked at the previous prerequisite task, there may have been a chance that we could have gotten some more continuous scoring, which would have helped us find the more finely measured correlations between TOM and the other tasks. And then also one limitation was previous exposure to assessments. So our CSL students have, as I had mentioned previously, the TOM task and the PPBT are incorporated in their school curriculum. So even though we had that suspension period before our study started, there was still a chance that they had some idea of the expectations and how the structure of the test run compared to the CDL students. So that was also a limitation. And again, like I had explained, we're working with children, task fatigue, attentional variability. This is something that's much more harder to control because we were working with children. We tried to control the time we worked in and control how much time we spent with them in the testing room so that to avoid these situations.
Yeah, just to recap, so our hypothesis predicted that having that high PPBT score, having good language skills and emotional understanding would relate positively to passing the theory of mind assessment, having a theory of mind. But our results showed no significant relationships that supported the thesis, besides that one significant finding where there was a good correlation between expressive and situational emotional understanding. This finding suggests that emotional understanding has internal consistency, but may not yet link to language or TOM. But overall, these findings do highlight the complexity of early development and suggest that these abilities may converge later rather than simultaneously, like how Lane said. And so therefore the implication is that early education should support these 3 domains, language, emotional understanding, and a theory of mind independently, rather than just assuming that progressing in one will automatically generalize to another uniformly. And so for future research purposes, there's 3 main things that we should focus on. 1 being a larger sample, 2 having use of more measures, and 3 completion of all tasks by all participants. And so in increasing sample size, we get to increase that probability of finding more statistically significant, if not moderate, correlations. And it will also help reduce the influence of outliers, such as a kid scoring in the 99th percentile of PPBT. It will help dilute those outliers to find those underlying relationships. And sorry, it's raining really loud over here. But also because we did use binary scoring of TOM, it did have that low variability. And so in the future, we would also look at those preliminary tasks and find a scoring system to include preliminary as well as belief-based tasks. And to expand on using more measures, we also think that we could use more of Denham's emotional understanding tasks in her study in 1996, as well as perhaps even including measures to assess for emotional expressivity on top of emotional understanding. And so there's a difference between emotional understanding versus expressivity, where understanding is being able to recognize and label emotions, as emotional expressivity is the ability to actually express those emotions themselves. So in order to measure emotional expressivity in future research, researchers could find questionnaires from past literatures, whether it be parent questionnaires or teacher questionnaires, to assess a child's emotional expressivity on top of maybe even daily observations, such as the ones done at the CSL by research assistants as well as teacher assistants. And of course, we should push to have all participants complete all tasks in order to minimize that error and to increase reliability.
And yeah, we'd like to thank our committee members one more time for their support throughout this process. And that's all from us. Thank you for listening, and we're happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. That was very informative. Wow, very well done. One of the things that I want to ask is, what motivated you to study this particular topic? Being that children are a bit can be a bit difficult to study.
Yeah, so actually how this started was, so me and Emily and our friends, we both want to go into pediatrics into the future. We both are in biomedical science together, and we're both studying psychology. And additionally, actually, specifically how this topic came about was we learned about the CSL. Emily works at the CSL, and we were able to get in touch with Director Kupfer, and we wanted to do something that included both kids and kids in science. That's basically, we wanted to look more into that because that is where both of our passions kind of align, and we were able to come up with a great idea with Dr. Kupfer, and we thought we should take this as a thesis, and that's kind of how this thesis began. That's how we grew. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and you did wonderfully with that, of course, under the direction of Dr. Kupfer. And I apologize, I'm getting quite a bit of thunder back here, so I
did too. Sorry.
Because it is, I can see how it would be so difficult to keep the structure, consistent with all the testing and all with little ones. And so I appreciated the limitations that you presented, that you experienced. You also mentioned culture briefly, right? I didn't see the demographics on that. However, I imagine that would be, in a different study, another something to study, right? Because of the cultural backgrounds of the children, based on language development, which in turn, is a big factor with brain development, in all, in everything involved, if that makes any sense. So anyway, I really appreciated your talk on those limitations. I would like to have the committee, if you have any comments, questions, and then we will wrap it around.
I do have a question. You collected those prerequisite skill data, so you have them. Why didn't you use them in your analyses? Because we kind of already know that children are not going to pass the belief tasks until they're around 5, possibly even 6 years old. So I'm a little confused why those other measures that have been shown to be, let's say, linearly in development, why you left them out of your analysis.
Right. So in terms of this, we were kind of really focused on getting like a composite score, like the other two assessments with PVT or having that composite score of that standard score, and then for emotional understanding, we were able to like narrow it down to 12 for each of them. For Tom, it was kind of difficult for us to figure out how to measure both preliminary as well as the belief task all in one. And so we thought that just in doing that false and true belief of 0 and 1, we would be able to just narrow it down to a child having a theory of mind or not. But obviously, looking at the results now and looking back, it is a very big limitation in our data where it did skew quite a bit of it and did skew our data. Yeah.
Yeah, so you do need to include a study that was done by Gonzalez, Fabricius, and myself in 2017, in which we did show that those preliminary tasks are, what can I say? They're orderly so that it's not a just pass-fail kind of thing. So we showed that, for example, self-perception occurs first, and approximately 6 months later, other perception will unfold. And after perception, then comes in self-knowledge. And then approximately 9 months after that, other knowledge. So it's a very orderly progression until a child finally gets to the belief tasks. So what you could find, and you still have those data there to look for this, is that the language skills and the emotion understanding could determine how quickly that child progresses through that development. Because we know already none of those children are really going to be passing the belief test at that age. And then I just have one other question. Did you find any child who did pass Tom?
Yes, we did. We had quite a couple. Most of them did come from the CSL. There were some from the CDL as well. I think with the results of finding those correlations between all three domains, it did affect what is assumed of children not passing TOM. Kids did pass the assessment of TOM. There was a good chunk who did, but with like all the
What do you mean
graphics.
by a good chunk?
Sorry.
Could you tell me how many?
I think there was I'm not sure, I think I can check again, because we didn't, I think it was around like, maybe like 10 at most with CDL and CSL.
That's remarkable. That's a remarkably high number of kids. Do you know what ages they were?
We all have it down in the software, but we don't have it on the web.
I do believe it was more, there wasn't any three, I think it was more towards 4 and 5 years old as you would expect, but I don't think there was any child that was 3 years old who passed TOM. So I'm pretty sure they were all closer to 5 years old, like 4.5 and higher. But we can go back and check on the specifics of those for.
That's it.
I had a question to kind of follow up on that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, it was about the age group that you had. I know that, well, I don't know, but I think you said most of the kids were between 4 and 5, 4.5 and 5, right? In your sample?
Most of the kids who passed TOM were between 4.5 and 5, but I believe we did have kids who from like exactly 3 to 5.
Oh, okay. So, because this is not something that you had to do, but this is just something that was interesting to me because earlier you mentioned in your lip review that for the emotional understanding, I think as far as I understood it, the emotional understanding had in the other research that you cited had a greater correlation at the earlier end with the PBT, right? And so I'm wondering. This is not something for now, but if you were to run this with younger students and just not focus on the TOM, but focus on the emotional understanding, because you yourself said that, the literature indicates that by the time they're 4 and 5, that relationship would go down. Do you think that if you had focused just on earlier, younger ages for that particular set of variables, that it might show something different?
It could have possibly showed something different, but that was the only literature we saw with that correlation. So maybe because we didn't look into that as much, it was just something we came upon while looking into ages 25. But I think maybe if we were looking at younger ages, we could possibly find it. But since that was the only literature we had, we're not sure because it was a bit. It didn't go according to our expectations. We were saying that it would get higher. But that one was a bit contrast to what we were thinking. But I think if we did more research into ages too, we could possibly find something to support his claims.
And this was just for my own curiosity because I know age and sex were not part of the variables that you looked at. And so it was just because in that age range, you mentioned that there was that trajectory. And so I just thought, so when they're 3, they have a higher correlation. And so I would have actually expected to have a lower correlation by the time that, if you had kids that were older. So, yeah. And so the other question I had was about the Cronbach's Alpha. Just I'm a little confused about how you explained it. Are you indicating that the Cronbach's Alpha shows that those two are distinct constructs? Because Cronbach Alpha would not necessarily doesn't do that. So I'm just trying to understand what that was.
So from my understanding, the Cronbach alpha coefficient is telling us how well you can put the variables that we tested, how well they can be measured under one scale. So I thought by changing it to just the emotional understanding, because when I had originally put in the PGVT and TOM as well, and when I looked at all of it, it was clearly a very low number because they are completely different constructs. But then when I changed it back to just the emotional understanding, there was still a low number. It was below threshold, and there was actually I had read in a literature that if you're under 10 items, they ask for at least the threshold to be above 0.5, and still with that threshold, we were still under 0.5 because we only had 3 items with 3 subtests. And so it was still low. So my understanding of that was the 3 of them can't be under one scale because situational and expressive, which were the 2 that were found to have a relation, are more using cognitive ability and emotion expression, while receptive was just quite literally the child would be told a word and then they had to just respond. So my understanding was they would be under different constructs because one is much more simple compared to the other 2. So that's why I believe the number was low. I think that's, yeah.
I mean, I understand what you're getting at. I just wanted to kind of follow up because the Cronbach's Alpha is just looking at the inter-rater reliability between those items to see how reliable they are. So if you wanted to make the claim that it was a different construct, that they were separate independent constructs, you would have to do like a factor analysis or something of that nature. This just basically tells you that that tool that you used is not quite as reliable as some other tools, and that just means that, and that's okay. It's just you have a very small number anyway. But I just wanted to make sure that that you're clear on what the difference is between.
Yeah.
No, this was excellent. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. I don't have any more questions.
I would just want to add with your Cronbach's Alpha thing. Actually, I don't think it made sense to do the Cronbach's Alpha the way you did. Really, if you're looking at internal consistency, like for example, that situational measure actually has 12 items? Am I right? 12 items in the situational measure? That's what you would run you're using a composite of, you're creating this composite by averaging the answers on those 12 items. That's what you would run a Cronbach's Alpha on to show that it's internally consistent within those 12 items to create your situational. And then for expressive, I can't remember if it's 4 items or 8 items. For expressive, you would do a Cronbach's Alpha on those 8 individual items. You wouldn't run a Cronbach's Alpha on the full subscale of situational, expressive, and receptive because you didn't use like a composite of emotion understanding.
Right. Okay.
So I would take all of that out actually, because it actually, in the way that you used Cronbach's Alpha, it doesn't make sense.
Okay. Would it be helpful to do it where we did the 8 tests? Would that be something that we should look into, or would it be better just?
I mean, you can do it. I think it's pretty clear to use those composites because it's been done in decades of work from Denham's study that they've created these composites. So I'm not terribly concerned about using those composites, and the reason why you would do a Cronbach's Alpha would be to show that these items hang together. We already know they do because Denham's been doing this for decades.
Right. Okay. Got it.
So not terribly worried about that. My biggest question, I think I'm along the same lines of Nasheen too with her questions, was about age. And I know we don't have a ton of time here, so I don't want to take up all the time, but I think age in this study, the range from 3 to 5, is actually like a fuller, right? Like the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old is so different. And to be able to just put them all together and then look for these differences and look for relations among it with all of those without looking at age in any way, I think is a big mistake. And I think it's taking away so much that we know about development and how much changes, like Anne was saying about how much changes across time with theory of mind. It's exactly the same for language skills. It's exactly the same for emotion understanding. I mean, there is a lot of evidence that age matters for each of your variables that you're looking at. So to just ignore it, even though it's not like a main research question, but to ignore it, I think is a mistake. I think another thing that you could do just in thinking about it is, if you wanted to do the most simplified way of managing it, is you could look at 3-year-olds, look at 4-year-olds, and look at 5-year-olds. I mean, that's like the absolute simplest way that you could actually just to see if there were any differences. You're not going to find anything with such a small sample, but I think just to be able to show the exact thing that you're saying is that, you know, relations might be different for 3-year-olds than they are for 5-year-olds, but you said you were replicating it, but you didn't actually look at that. So I think that you've got to consider age in here. It's just like such an incredibly important variable. And then other variables that I'd suggest that you just at least take a look at are things like, you know, gender, and which, if they're at the CDL versus the CSL, those are things that, again, I know it wasn't a main hypothesis, but it's just as descriptive information would be helpful for the reader. And then one other thing that just in your tables too, I would say, because you're using dichotomous for theory of mind, seeing like a 0.19 as your mean is not very meaningful. I think it would be really helpful for us to know what percentage of kids passed the first belief test, and then what percentage of kids passed the next. It gives us a little bit more actual information, and then you could, I don't know if you were using like if they passed both, then they would get a 1, or if they, so then just let us know on each of those, how many passed at each of those levels, and then I guess you just added them up. I don't know if you added up to create your composite score, but just a lot more detail on why you did what you did, I think is really, really helpful just as researchers. And this is just, you know, really what you've done for an undergraduate thesis is certainly, you know, an excellent way to show that you've learned a lot about research. Just trying to give you some like professional development on ways that which researchers would be thinking about these things.
Got it.
So
Okay.
I just want to jump in here because I'm the one that told Emil and Emily to take that information out because it was just so much information focusing on that, and it wasn't part of their hypothesis. So that was really something that they did because of my suggestion. And so they do have that information, which is wonderful. And I think you don't need all of those. I think just explaining the information as, you know, kind of part of the descriptives, as you were saying, would be much more meaningful rather than showing like a bunch of, so because that took away from the main hypotheses that you had, so.
Okay. So we'll make sure to include that in the written part as well, yeah.
Okay. Excellent questions, some excellent discussion, excellent presentation. It was a very, very complex study, obviously, you know, working with children. Particularly, we had much discussion about the age group, and so yeah, you know, we know that, you know, there is a big difference, you know, in development between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. However, I did learn some new information based on your lit review from these other studies. Reference the TOM, and what's interesting is that it made me think of my own grandchildren. I have a 2 and a 5-year-old grandchild, and I'm thinking, wow, that really applies. Wow. So yeah, and I know that, you know, you could have, I know that the feedback, the very constructive feedback that you just received from the committee will also help you to better understand your study, and this is a great start for something bigger. If you wanted to go bigger, again,